He shouldn't have stopped. A battle-hardened Marine, worn by years of war, found himself pulling over on a stretch of sun-faded Arizona desert highway, just because his retired K-9 partner began growling at nothing but wind. The horizon shimmered like glass, the air still as a held breath. Yet from the brush of brittle cactus and dry mesquite, something faint stirred. Nolan Graves, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, retired but never really free, stepped out of his dented 1989 Chevy pickup. His boots met cracked sand that had forgotten rain. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Beside him, his old partner Rex, a black and tan German shepherd with one scarred leg and eyes that mirrored his handler's weariness, tensed, nose twitching toward the thicket. "Easy, boy," Nolan murmured. But Rex didn't ease. He gave a short, low bark, alert, insistent. Nolan followed his gaze, parting a patch of cactus, when something caught the sun, a corner of splintered wood beneath a filthy, wind-stained tarp. He crouched, tugging the tarp aside, and froze. Inside the warped crate were 3 German shepherd puppies. They were tied loosely with frayed twine, trembling, their ribs showing beneath matted fur. They were still alive, but barely. No sound but a whimper, soft and uncertain, as if the desert itself exhaled through them. The heat had been cruel, the shade fleeting. Nolan's throat tightened. He reached in, careful, steady, the way soldiers handle both explosives and miracles. The smallest pup had a ragged cloth around its neck. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper. The ink had bled from sweat and time, but the message was simple. They deserve a chance. For a long time, Nolan said nothing. The wind lifted a swirl of dust across his boots, the sun throwing long shadows over the crate. Rex stood silently beside him, gaze fixed not on the pups, but on his handler. Waiting. He could have made the call. Animal control, the sheriff's office, protocol. But Nolan had seen too many systems fail the helpless. Out there, in war or desert, what saved lives wasn't policy, it was instinct. Heart. Memory. He took off his worn fatigue jacket, spread it open on the sand, and gently wrapped the pups inside. Their bodies were so light it hurt. One whimpered softly, another licked his thumb, their warmth fragile against his chest. Nolan exhaled. "We're taking them home." Rex barked once, deep and approving. The sun dipped low behind the Rincon Mountains as they pulled back onto the road. The Chevy's cracked windshield caught the last flare of orange sky. Inside, the radio stayed silent, just the hum of tires on gravel and the soft, uneven breaths of 3 rescued lives bundled in a Marine's arms. By the time they reached the small modular house off dusty trail road, night had settled heavy and cool. The desert changed at dusk, it stopped pretending to be endless and turned into something close, secret, almost protective. Nolan parked under the leaning shade of a mesquite tree. The porch light flickered, fighting off moths. The house itself was plain, a single story, whitewashed walls, tin roof, no wind chimes. It was the kind of place that didn't expect visitors. Inside, the air was cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of propane heat. Nolan set the bundled jacket on the old leather couch, unwrapping the pups one by one as if unsealing relics from another world. They blinked, dazed but alive, still too young to understand that they'd been spared. Rex stood close, his stance rigid, tail low but steady. He circled once, then sat. Not threat, not surrender, just awareness. Nolan rummaged through the storage closet, found an old army blanket and a fleece hoodie, and arranged them into a makeshift nest near the heater's orange hum. He placed the pups gently down. They shifted, nestled into each other, 3 fragile heartbeats beating in sync. Nolan sat beside Rex, hand resting on the old dog's shoulder. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was peace earned. For the first time in months, maybe years, the house didn't feel like an outpost. It felt like shelter. Morning arrived slow and pale, a washed-out Arizona dawn creeping through the blinds. The air smelled faintly of dust and fur, the kind of scent that meant life had dared to stay the night. Nolan rubbed his face, pushing away the weight of sleep. He'd spent most of the night half awake, listening for sounds from the makeshift nest by the heater. When he finally rose, the pups were curled together, breathing in rhythm, a tangled knot of warmth and trust. The smallest one, the tan female, shifted first, blinking up at him. She had darker shading along her ears and tail, a face both delicate and defiant. The other two, both males, stirred soon after. One was thick-set with broad paws, the other lankier, one ear flopped awkwardly to the side. Nolan crouched down. "Morning, troops," he muttered. "You made it." Rex sat a few feet away, tail tapping once against the floor, the old soldier's form of approval. Nolan fed Rex first, leftover rice and chicken from last night, before realizing he had nothing for the pups. No milk, no bottles, not even a dish small enough. He glanced around the sparse kitchen inside. Then he remembered the neighbor. Judith Henley. He hadn't spoken to her in months. A widow in her 60s, known for her garden and her ability to get information without ever asking a question outright. Her house sat just across the barbed wire fence. Nolan usually kept his distance. But now, 3 hungry lives made that distance irrelevant. 10 minutes later, he stood at the edge of the yard, one hand resting on the fence post. "Morning, Miss Henley." Judith looked up from her vegetable patch. She wore a wide-brimmed hat with a faded pink ribbon, jeans patched at the knees, and gloves that had seen too many summers. She squinted, eyes bright under the brim. "Well, morning, Staff Sergeant. You come to arrest my tomatoes?" "Not today, ma'am," Nolan said, his voice dry as the air between them. "I need a favor." Her brows rose. "That right? What kind?" "Milk," he said. "Or puppy formula if you've got it." Judith straightened, removing her gloves slowly. "Did you just say puppy?" Nolan nodded once. "I thought you didn't do noise," she said, half smiling. "Or company." "Didn't go looking for it," Nolan replied. "Found them out near Highway 79 yesterday. Someone dumped them." Judith's expression softened. "Lord have mercy." She shook her head. "And here I thought you were emotionally bankrupt." Nolan gave the faintest smirk. "Not bankrupt, just heavily mortgaged." She chuckled, waving him toward her porch. "Come on then, let's find something before those babies start yelping." Inside, her kitchen was a crowded museum of life, floral curtains, faded tiles, ceramic roosters, the faint smell of coffee and lavender. On the wall hung a photograph of a young man in a navy uniform, eyes bright and proud. Nolan noticed her glance linger there. "My son," she said quietly. "Jacob. Lost off Okinawa. Submarine fire. They sent me a flag, not a body." He nodded, voice low. "I'm sorry." She reached into a cabinet, pulling out a small container of powdered formula and 2 old baby bottles. "Had a dog once, Benny. Saved me after Jacob died. He'd just sit by the bed, breathing steady. Sometimes that was enough." "Dogs are like that," Nolan said softly. Judith handed him the supplies, her gaze steady. "You planning on keeping them?" He hesitated. "Don't know yet." "You name them?" He paused, glancing toward the window where the desert glared gold and still. "The tan one, maybe Belle. The stocky one, Dusty. And the quiet one, Scout." Judith smiled faintly. "Scout, huh? That one'll break your heart, I can tell." When Nolan returned home, the pups were awake and restless. Belle tried to climb over her brothers, Dusty yapped like he was already in command, Scout sat off to the side, head tilted, cautious. He mixed the formula, poured it into the bottles, and fed them one by one. Dusty barked between gulps, Belle licked his fingers long after she was done, and Scout drank silently, eyes locked on Nolan's face like he was memorizing it. Rex stood nearby, still and dignified. He didn't interfere, but when Nolan turned away for a moment, the old dog stepped closer, lowering himself beside the nest, not touching, just near. A sentry keeping watch. By evening, the house was quiet again. The pups slept in a pile of fleece, the heater humming softly. Rex rested at Nolan's feet, eyes half closed. Nolan picked up his old field notebook from the shelf. The same one he hadn't opened since Afghanistan. The paper was yellowed, the edges curled. He turned to a blank page and wrote. October 19th, found them. Or maybe they found me. Maybe there's still something left to save. He set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. Outside, the stars over Tucson stretched like scattered ash across the sky. For the first time in years, Nolan Graves didn't feel like a man waiting to disappear. The Arizona days slipped by quietly after that, one sunrise melting into another beneath a pale, forgiving sky. October was giving way to November, the light still golden, but the nights now sharper, whispering of the coming winter. The desert didn't change suddenly. It simply endured, the way soldiers do when the war is technically over but never really gone. Nolan stood barefoot on the cold kitchen floor, pouring kibble into a cracked ceramic bowl. The pups clambered around his boots in a chaos of tails and oversized paws. Belle limped slightly, but she didn't seem to notice it. Dusty barked impatiently, shoving forward, while Scout hesitated on the edge, waiting his turn like a gentleman. Rex sat nearby, watching the circus with quiet authority, tail thumping once in rhythm. Nolan leaned on the counter, arms crossed. Something wasn't right. Belle's limp hadn't improved much over the week. And Scout, though alert, seemed unsettled. Every sudden noise, a door creak, the drop of a wrench, sent him flinching into corners. Dusty, on the other hand, was all boldness and noise, shadowing Rex everywhere like an apprentice. It was time for answers. Nolan loaded the 3 pups into an old green army duffel lined with towels. Rex climbed into the passenger seat without being told, he always knew when duty called. The pickup rattled down the dirt road into town, leaving behind the silence of dusty trail road for the slow hum of Tucson's outskirts. The sign outside the squat brick building read, Dr. Howard Glay, DVM. The bell above the clinic door jingled as Nolan stepped in, duffel over his shoulder. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. A young woman with auburn hair and tortoiseshell glasses looked up from the front desk. Her scrubs were mint green with embroidered paw prints. "Morning," she said with a practiced smile. "New patients?" "Found 3 pups," Nolan replied. "They need checking over." She nodded, rising from her seat. "I'm Renee. Dr. Glay's finishing up a surgery. You can wait in room 2. Inside, the room was bright and plain, white walls decorated with cartoon dogs and party hats, an exam table gleaming under the overhead light. Nolan set the duffel on the floor and opened it. The pups tumbled out in a blur of motion. Belle first, cautious but curious. Dusty barking at his reflection in the metal tray. Scout hovering near the corner, watching everything but moving only when Nolan did. A few minutes later, the door opened. Dr. Howard Glay was tall, broad in the shoulders, his white hair slicked neatly back. A mustache framed his weathered face, giving him the air of a retired general who'd seen enough chaos to respect quiet. His eyes were sharp, pale blue beneath heavy brows. "Morning, Staff Sergeant," he said without needing an introduction. "Heard you've picked up a small platoon." Nolan cracked a faint grin. "Something like that." Glay knelt by Belle first, his movement steady and sure. He pressed along her joints, flexed the hind leg gently, and frowned. "Malformed femur. Maybe congenital, maybe an untreated fracture early on. She'll always limp, but she's not in pain. She's compensating beautifully." Next came Scout. The pup flinched at the first touch, and Nolan instinctively steadied him, holding him close. Glay's tone softened. "Easy there, little man." He ran a flashlight over Scout's eyes, then listened to his heart. Classic symptoms of early life stress. Could be neglect, maybe rough handling. Dogs remember, especially shepherds. Finally, Dusty. The pup squirmed with excitement, licking Glay's hands as the vet checked his teeth and paws. "Healthy," Glay said. "High energy, strong frame, maybe too confident for his own good. You'll have your hands full." Nolan nodded. "Story of my life." Glay stood, folding his arms. "You said you found them near Highway 79. Yeah. Crate in the brush. No sign of who left them." The vet's eyes narrowed slightly. "If I had to guess, these weren't backyard dogs. They've seen structure, commands, conditioning. The way Scout flinches, the posture of the others, it's familiar." Nolan's jaw tightened. "What kind of conditioning?" "Military style," Glay said quietly. "Or paramilitary. There've been whispers lately, illegal breeders raising working dogs for private contracts. Harsh environments, no oversight. They dump the rejects when they can't sell them." Silence filled the room, thick and dry as the desert outside. Nolan's hands flexed unconsciously. Not from the old kind of anger, the battlefield kind, but something deeper, quieter. It was the kind of rage born from recognition. "What do I do?" he asked finally. Glay met his eyes. "You do what you've always done, Sergeant. Train them. Heal them. Let them be dogs again." By the time Nolan and Rex pulled back into the driveway, the sun was starting to burn low behind the saguaro silhouettes. He unloaded the pups, setting them gently on the dusty ground. Then he got to work. The backyard had always been bare, a patch of sand and scrub, scattered with old tires. But by sunset, he'd cleared a space, driven in fence posts, stretched nylon cord around the perimeter, and laid out Rex's old toys. From a storage chest, he pulled a rolled-up canvas tent from his last deployment and pitched it near 2 mesquite trees. Their new base camp. When it was done, he stood with his arms crossed, sweat running down his back, watching the pups explore their new world. Belle sniffed the tent and curled up in its shade. Scout tested the edges, nose to the ground. Dusty barked at a cactus until Rex gave him a look that translated perfectly, "Discipline, kid." Nolan gave a soft whistle. All three turned. He smiled faintly. "Let's see what you can learn." And just like that, the first lesson began. Sit. Stay. Come. The words weren't orders, they were bridges. Rex, without command, stepped forward and demonstrated each move with slow, deliberate grace. The pups watched, mirrored him clumsily. Nolan's voice stayed calm, low, sure. For the first time in a long while, the Marine and his K-9 partner were back on a mission, not one written by command, but by compassion. The desert sun leaned low, throwing long gold beams across Nolan's fenced yard. Dust hung in the air like memory, stirred now and then by a lazy wind tumbling over the wire fence. The heat had eased, softening into a mellow warmth that made the sky glow faintly copper. Nolan stood in the center of the enclosure, whistle between his lips, boots kicking up light clouds of grit. Scout, stay. Dusty, come. Belle, easy now. The pups obeyed in fits and starts, clumsy, eager, half wrong but improving. Dusty's confidence had turned him into a whirlwind of energy. Belle moved slower but steady, and Scout, though hesitant at first, now followed voice and motion with new trust. Under the lone mesquite tree, Rex lay like a seasoned general overseeing his troops. His tongue lolled, but his gaze missed nothing. When a pup faltered, Rex rose, executed the move correctly, and then returned to his post without fanfare. The unspoken message was clear: watch. Learn. Earn it. Nolan was halfway through another drill when the sound of tires on gravel made him pause. He turned toward the front gate just as a pale blue Ford Bronco rolled to a stop beneath the shade of a Joshua tree. The driver stepped out, a woman in olive cargo pants and a lightweight tactical vest. Her sleeves were rolled, revealing lean, muscular arms dusted with old scars. Her hair was strawberry blonde, pulled back into a low ponytail, and her stride was the kind of smooth that came from knowing how to move in dangerous places without wasting a step. She walked to the gate and called out, "You Graves?" Nolan nodded slowly. "I am." "I'm Danny Ray," she said, flipping a laminated badge on her belt. "Southern Arizona Animal Rescue, Volunteer Coordinator. Got a call from Dr. Glay about 3 shepherd pups. Malnourished, behavioral flags, former Marine in charge of rehab. Thought I'd come see for myself." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it wasn't casual either. Nolan gestured toward the yard. "You're welcome to look." She entered, closing the gate behind her. The pups had frozen mid-play, 3 pairs of curious eyes fixed on the stranger. Dusty bounded forward first, tail wagging wildly. Belle followed, cautious but curious. Scout lingered at the back, watching everything with a quiet calculation that reminded Nolan of his own reflection. Rex remained under the tree, his ears perked but his body still. Danny crouched, holding out her hand for Dusty to sniff before gently lifting his paw, inspecting pads and nails. "Good reflexes," she murmured, then moved to Belle, running a thumb along her bad leg. "This the one with the limp?" "Yeah," Nolan said. "Born that way, or maybe an old fracture." "And Scout?" she asked, glancing at the third pup. "Spooked easy," he replied. "He's getting better." She nodded, rising and brushing her palms on her cargo pants. Then her eyes lifted to him. "You military?" Nolan hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Marine. 16 years. Retired after Afghanistan. K-9 infantry." Her gaze flicked to Rex. "He was your partner?" "Yeah. Last deployment. Took shrapnel near Kandahar. We both came home a little less than whole." Something softened in her face. "Army," she said quietly. "Fort Bragg. I trained tactical K-9s. My last dog, Cinder, didn't make it out of Iraq." The air between them went still. Not uncomfortable, just full of mutual understanding. After a pause, Nolan broke it. "You want coffee or water?" That was it, no ceremony, no invitation for more. But it was the first time in years he'd asked anyone into his home. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of cedar oil and worn leather. Danny sat in an armchair patched with old fabric, the pup sprawled near her boots. Rex lay by the fireplace, eyes half open but alert as ever. "Judith Henley said you don't talk to people much," Danny said, watching Dusty tug at her shoelace. "She's right," Nolan replied, pouring coffee into chipped mugs. "Don't usually have a reason to." "What changed?" He set the mugs down and glanced toward the pups. "They didn't ask me to talk. They just needed someone to show up." Danny smiled faintly. "That's how it starts. They don't demand. They just exist, and somehow that's enough." They drank in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Later, they went back outside. Danny set a small concrete block on the ground and crouched beside Belle. "Try this," she said, guiding the pup's front paws onto the step. "Good for balance and muscle strength." Nolan watched as she encouraged Belle in a low, steady voice. The dog's hind leg trembled but didn't collapse. "You've done this before," he said. "I used to rehabilitate service dogs who lost their handlers," she replied. "Most were considered too broken to save. But if you gave them purpose again, they came back." He nodded slowly. No words necessary. He understood. Before she left, Danny knelt beside Rex. She held out her hand. Rex sniffed it, then pressed his nose against her fingers. He still watches you, she said softly. Like he's waiting for a command. He doesn't need orders, Nolan answered. Just needs to know I'm still here. Danny looked up. So do they. As she climbed into her Bronco, Nolan raised a hand. She didn't smile, but she nodded, a small, crisp gesture of respect. When the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Nolan stood in the yard until the last bit of daylight slipped away. The pups rested at his feet, huddled against Rex. That night, when he whistled softly from the porch, all 3 pups came running, no hesitation, no confusion. Dusty led the charge this time, Belle trotted beside him, and Scout, for the first time, ran ahead of them all. The Marine smiled into the quiet dark. The healing had begun, on both sides of the leash. Morning came pale and quiet, the sky a thin sheet of silver stretched over the desert. A storm was building somewhere far off. Nolan could feel it in the way the wind paused before exhaling, the way the light dimmed at the edges. Veterans always knew when change was coming. He stood on the porch with a steaming mug in hand, watching the pups tumble through the yard. Scout stalked Dusty from behind a cactus, ears flat and tail stiff, while Belle lay stretched out near Rex, her good ear flicking lazily at gnats. Rex's breathing had slowed with age, but his eyes still swept the horizon. Even now, he moved like a sentinel carved from discipline. Nolan sipped his coffee, letting the warmth chase the morning chill from his bones. He hadn't slept deeply, but he'd slept better, the kind of rest that comes when the nightmares fade just enough to let in light. After breakfast, he decided to tackle something he'd been putting off for years, the old storage shed behind the house. The hinges shrieked when he pulled the doors open. Inside, dust lay thick as history. Boxes, tarps, old military crates stacked in uneven towers. The scent of oil, rope, and long-forgotten sweat hung in the air. He dragged a crate into the light and pried it open. Inside were remnants from a different life, spare patches, a tattered field map, a dented canteen, a black leather notebook with a frayed elastic band. He sat on the cool earth and thumbed through the pages. Tactical diagrams. Coordinates. Names. Half-finished lists and sketches. His handwriting, all edges and angles, like him. Then a line caught his eye, written in the middle of a page, in faded ink. To save one life is to save the whole world. He didn't remember writing it, but he stared at the words for a long time. Maybe it had been scrawled on some sleepless night, back when belief still felt possible. A shuffle behind him made him look up. Scout sat in the doorway, head tilted, tail brushing the dirt. Nolan smiled faintly. "You ghosts," he murmured, reaching to scratch behind the pup's ear. "You showed up like a memory that refused to die." Scout leaned into his hand, eyes soft. "Maybe that's a good thing," Nolan said quietly. "Maybe this place was worth haunting after all." Later that afternoon, a familiar rumble echoed down the drive. The blue Bronco stopped by the gate. Danny climbed out, dressed down in jeans and a gray hoodie, her hair damp from morning kennel work. She carried a small bag in one hand and a grin that wasn't quite a smile but close enough. "Brought bribes," she said, tossing a piece of jerky toward Rex, who caught it midair with the precision of an old pro. "And a toy for Dusty, though I suspect it'll last about 5 minutes. "Optimistic," Nolan said dryly. They walked the fence line together as the pups wrestled nearby. The desert air was warm again, heavy with the promise of rain. "You ever think about letting them do something more?" Danny asked suddenly. Nolan frowned. "Like what?" "There's a therapy program at the VA," she said. "Pilot project for K-9 assisted therapy. They bring in dogs for morale visits, trauma support, that sort of thing. I've been volunteering there since I got out." He looked skeptical. "They're not ready." "Not today," she said. "But soon. Belle's got patience, she reads people." Scout feels everything in a room before anyone speaks. And Dusty, well, he's basically a one-dog parade. That earned a small chuckle. You're not wrong. She glanced at him. You've given them purpose, Nolan. But don't you see? They've given you one too. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, when the house was quiet again, he opened his field notebook to a blank page and wrote. Day 17, Belle anticipates commands. Scout sits beside me when I'm quiet. Dusty fought the sprinkler today. We all lost. He hesitated, then added beneath it. Maybe healing isn't about fixing what broke. Maybe it's tending the field until something grows again. The next morning, the yard was transformed. With Danny's help, Nolan had built small training stations, a ramp and balance box for Belle, a circle of cones for Dusty, and a hand choice exercise for Scout to build trust. Belle moved slower but steadier now, her limp softening as strength returned. Dusty zipped through the cones like a bullet with paws. Scout picked the correct hand 3 times in a row, then rested his chin on Nolan's knee, content. Judith arrived just before sunset, a loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil under her arm. Brought leftovers, she said, though Nolan knew better. She stood by the fence, watching as the pups practiced. You ever think of writing this all down? He looked at her. I do, in my old op book. I mean properly, she said. Write it like it matters. Maybe someone else needs to know how to find their way back, too. He smiled faintly. I'm no writer. No, Judith said gently. You're a man living something worth writing. That evening, when the sun fell behind the mountains, Nolan sat on the porch. The pups slept in a warm heap at his feet, Rex beside them, the old dog's gaze fixed on the glowing desert. He opened his notebook once more and wrote the words that had been circling his mind all week. Maybe saving lives doesn't come in fire and thunder. Maybe it comes quietly, on 4 legs, with muddy paws and wide eyes. Maybe saving them was how I learned to save myself. The ink bled slightly on the page, but he didn't mind. For the first time in a decade, his handwriting didn't look like a report. It looked like hope. The sun hadn't yet climbed above the ridge line when Nolan loaded the pups into the back of his old Ford. The morning air was cool, sharp, the kind that made the desert seem briefly merciful. Thin clouds drifted over the Rincon Mountains, washing the sky in muted silver. Rex was already in the passenger seat, calm and silent, eyes tracking every motion with that old soldier's patience. In the crate behind them, Belle, Dusty, and Scout bounced with tail-wagging excitement, oblivious to the quiet tension that sat in Nolan's shoulders. Ahead, the VA hospital rose from the desert plain, sandstone and glass, modern but strangely out of place amid the rusted signage and weathered cactus skeletons. Nolan stared at it a long moment before turning into the parking lot. Hospitals carried ghosts. He could feel them already, faces, names, the weight of rooms that remembered too much. Danny was waiting near the entrance, her blue volunteer polo neatly pressed, a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her hair was tied in a bun, a few loose strands catching the light. You made it, she said, smiling, not wide, but steady, the kind of smile built for people who were learning how to show up again. Still time to turn around, Nolan muttered, but the joke didn't land. His throat was tight. Too late, she said. They've been asking for dogs all week. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. Everything was beige and soft-edged, as though the designers had tried too hard to make it gentle. They passed a janitor humming under his breath, mopping the floor. When she saw the dogs, her face brightened. Well, aren't y'all bringing sunshine, she said. Nolan nodded once, but the warmth in her voice lingered long after they'd turned the corner. The therapy wing wasn't large, just 4 rooms and a small common area with worn chairs and a faux fireplace that buzzed softly behind a glass screen. Danny knelt by the crate, unlatched the door, and let the pups tumble out. Follow their lead, she whispered. Let them choose who they go to. The first room belonged to George, a wiry man in his 70s with a white beard and a comic book resting open on his lap. His eyes were dull, the kind that had long stopped expecting surprise. Then Dusty bounded in, tail spinning like a propeller, climbed straight onto George's recliner, and licked his cheek before anyone could react. George blinked. Then, slowly, almost unwillingly, a chuckle escaped him. "You've got terrible manners," he said, voice rough but alive. "I like you." Danny glanced at Nolan. He didn't speak, but the look on his face said enough. In the next room, Belle moved with quiet grace, hopping onto the edge of a bed where an older woman lay propped against pillows. Evelyn, late 60s, silver hair, a prosthetic where her leg had once been. Belle didn't lick or bark, she simply rested her chin on the blanket. Evelyn's eyes filled, her hand trembling as she stroked the soft fur. "Quiet company," she whispered. "Just what I needed." Nolan turned away, jaw tightening. There was something holy in that silence. Scout, meanwhile, was led into the third room. Inside sat Curtis, a former Navy corpsman who had stopped speaking years ago. He stared out the window, eyes lost somewhere far beyond the desert. Scout crept forward slowly, pausing once, then twice. Finally, he sat beside the man's leg, leaned his body gently against it, and stayed still. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Curtis's hand, weathered, shaking, reached down and began to stroke the dog's head. No words. Just breath, warmth, and the smallest proof that connection still existed. Out in the hallway, a male nurse hurried past, clipboard in hand. Rex's ears snapped forward. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Nolan reacted instantly, crouching beside him, palm pressed to the old dog's flank. "Easy, buddy," he murmured. "It's over. It's just a hallway." The nurse turned, startled. Danny stepped in, calm as stone. "Sorry," she said smoothly. "Former K-9. He still scans for threats." The man nodded and moved on. Nolan kept his hand on Rex a moment longer. "You're not wrong," he whispered. "But we're safe now." Later, in the staff break room, Danny poured 2 cups of burnt coffee. The pup slept in a pile near the wall, exhausted from a morning full of new friends and gentle hands. Rex lay nearby, one eye half open. "You okay?" Danny asked quietly. "No," Nolan said, honest as always. "But maybe that's the point." Danny nodded, staring into her cup. "First time I came back here after deployment, I almost didn't make it through the door. I kept waking up gasping, still hearing explosions in the silence." She took a breath. "My therapist said to find something that reminded me life wasn't over. So I brought a rescue pup from the shelter. The day that dog climbed into a patient's lap, they both just breathed. I realized I was watching something sacred." She looked up at him. "That dog saved me before he ever saved anyone else." Nolan said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth of it sat between them, quiet and solid. He glanced down at the notebook peeking from his jacket pocket. He didn't write anything that day. He didn't have to. The story was already being written, in licks, sighs, and soft tails thudding against hospital floors. That evening, when they got home, the sky was painted with streaks of violet and rust. The pups bounded out of the truck, racing into the yard with wild joy. Dusty barked at nothing in particular. Belle trotted toward the porch, her limp barely noticeable. Scout paused halfway, turned, and looked back at Nolan. Rex settled by the gate, lying down with a sigh that sounded like peace. Nolan stood on the porch, watching them all. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an observer standing outside of life. He was in it, hands dirty, heart open, surrounded by motion and meaning. He whispered into the desert air, "We made it, didn't we?" Rex lifted his head, as if answering, and the last of the daylight caught the old dog's eyes, still sharp, still loyal, still here. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, the kind of desert day where even the wind seemed to rest its voice. Nolan's truck rolled up the gravel drive, tires crunching in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. In the back seat, Belle and Scout had fallen asleep, heads resting against each other. Dusty, restless as ever, barked twice as the house came into view, tail thumping against the crate. Rex hopped out first when the truck stopped, landing stiffly but with purpose. He trotted toward the porch like a soldier reporting for duty. Nolan followed, fatigue settling into his shoulders. The VA visit had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. Healing, he realized, demanded as much energy as surviving. That's when he saw it, a small yellow envelope resting on the porch rail. No postage, no return address. Just his name, scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting. Nolan frowned, picking it up. The paper was thick, textured, heavier than it should have been. Whoever left it had done so quietly, deliberately. He turned it over once, twice, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. Inside, the pups bounded toward their nest while Rex claimed his usual post near the window. Nolan sat at the kitchen table, the envelope before him. The light through the blind striped across it, thin and golden. He opened it carefully, unfolding the flap. A photograph slid out. 3 puppies, tiny, trembling, curled in a wooden crate half buried beneath cactus brush. Even through the grainy blur, he recognized them instantly, Dusty, Scout, Belle. His breath caught. On the back of the photo were a few words, written in that same shaky hand. I couldn't care for them, but I hope you did. Beneath the photo was a folded piece of paper, creased and smudged. He unfolded it, the edges soft from handling. The letter read. They were mine once. Not by blood, but by bond. I trained dogs for the military, like you. After I came home, I lost everything. The work. The steadiness. My mind, maybe. The pups came from a shepherd I couldn't afford to keep. I tried to find homes, but no one wanted pups from a broken man. I left them there, not because I didn't care. But because I knew I had nothing left to give. I've seen you, from the ridge, from my truck. You didn't just save them. You brought them back to life. Maybe that means there's still some good in what I tried to do. I'm sorry for abandoning them. But I knew I left them in the right hands. No name. No address. Just the ghost of a man written in ink and grief. Nolan sat motionless, his fingers tightening around the page. The old version of him, the one who used anger like armor, would have cursed the letter, balled it up, burned it in the sink. But not now. Now he just felt, still. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and stared out the window. In the yard, Dusty was wrestling Scout, Belle watching them both with patient amusement. Rex stood nearby, his gaze turned toward the horizon. Maybe the man who left that letter hadn't given up. Maybe he'd just run out of strength. And maybe, Nolan thought, they weren't so different. That evening, as the last of the light slipped behind the saguaros, Nolan crossed the yard to Judith's house. She opened the door with her usual half-smile, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. Behind her, the faint smell of cinnamon and coffee floated through the screen door. He handed her the envelope without a word. She read in silence, her weathered fingers trembling slightly as she traced the ink. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy, her voice soft. Poor man, she murmured. This world doesn't offer gentle landings, does it? Nolan shook his head. No. It doesn't. They stood there for a moment, quiet except for the sound of the wind brushing over the dry grass. Still, Judith said, closing the letter gently, maybe he found his peace through you. Through them. Maybe, Nolan said. When he left, the stars were just beginning to pierce the dusk, bright and close like 1,000 small mercies. The next morning, Danny drove out after her shift, dust rising behind her Bronco. She still wore her work boots, the leather scuffed and stained. Her braid was loose, her face tired but calm. They spread the photo and letter across Nolan's kitchen table, examining every line and fold. Danny snapped a picture of the handwriting. "I'll check with rescue contacts," she said. "Might be able to trace him through old trainer networks. Sometimes people go quiet before they disappear completely." Nolan nodded. "If he's out there, I'd like to tell him they made it." She smiled faintly. "I think he already knows. They found no name, no record." But somehow, Nolan didn't feel disappointment. What filled the space instead was something gentler, a sense of closure, of understanding. That night, after Danny left, Nolan sat on the edge of his bed. Rex lay near the door, one ear twitching in his sleep. The pups were curled in their crate, breathing slow and even. Nolan opened his notebook and began to write. "To the one who couldn't stay. I understand now. You didn't abandon them. You entrusted them. And I've tried to do right by that trust. They saved me, every single day." He set the pen down and closed the notebook softly, his hand resting on the worn cover. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and sand through the cracked window. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the man who'd written that letter might still be out there, or maybe just his memory, lingering in the wind like an echo that had finally found rest. The late afternoon sun poured like honey over the desert, warm and golden, the kind of light that made even dust look sacred. The wind was soft that day, brushing gently across Nolan's porch and stirring the scent of mesquite and dry earth. He sat on the wooden steps, elbows on his knees, a half-empty mug cooling between his hands. He hadn't moved in a while, not because he was tired, though he was, but because stillness finally felt earned. Before him, the yard was alive. Dusty tore across the patchy grass with a chewed-up tennis ball clutched proudly in his jaws, two small children in joyful pursuit. Belle followed at her own steady pace, her limp now barely noticeable, tail swishing like a flag of quiet triumph. Scout sat near the patio's edge, watchful and calm, his gaze flicking between the kids, the dogs, and the horizon, as if guarding both the living and the memory of what once was. Nolan's lips twitched into a faint smile. The laughter of the children mixed with the rustle of the wind, filling spaces in him that had once only known silence. The older of the two, Claire Henley, Judith's granddaughter, marched right up to him and plopped down on the step beside him. She was 8 years old, all elbows and dirt-smudged knees, her hair tied into a messy braid that refused to stay neat. Around her shoulders, a faded kitchen towel served as a superhero cape. "You look like a superhero," she declared matter-of-factly. Nolan raised an eyebrow. "Do I now?" She nodded solemnly. "Yeah. Like the ones who hide out in the mountains, 'cause they lost someone, but then come back when the world needs saving." A rare laugh rumbled from Nolan's chest, surprising even him. "I think I just look like a guy with bad knees." Claire tilted her head, unimpressed. "Maybe. But you saved those dogs. That's kind of like saving a galaxy." Nolan looked across the yard again. Dusty had finally dropped the ball and was rolling gleefully in the dirt. Belle nudged one of the children toward the shade, and Scout, steadfast as ever, watched it all like a sentry. Near the porch, Rex rested under the shade, his fur grayed around the muzzle, his eyes clouded but bright with quiet pride. Each breath was slower now, deliberate. The old dog had aged gracefully, the way warriors do when they've made peace with the fight. Judith appeared at the gate, carrying a foil-wrapped pie that smelled of cinnamon and apple. The sun caught her silver hair, twisted neatly into a bun. She was dressed in a soft blue cotton dress and sandals that squeaked faintly on the porch steps. "You better not be feeding those babies plain kibble again," she called out. "Guilty," Nolan said, standing to help her with the pie. She huffed. "You should know better. Apple pie for the humans, sweet potato for the pups." She handed a small tin to Claire. "Go on," share these with your furry siblings. The girl took off, cape fluttering, laughter trailing behind her. Not long after, a familiar Bronco rolled up the drive, kicking a swirl of pale dust into the golden light. Danny stepped out, wearing faded jeans and a green flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. Her auburn braid had loosened, strands escaping to frame her face. Freckles dotted her cheeks where the sun had kissed her skin. Rex's tail thumped weakly when he saw her. "He's slowing down," Danny said gently as she approached. "Yeah," Nolan replied, crouching beside the old shepherd, scratching behind his ears. "But he's earned the rest." Danny knelt too, her hand brushing Rex's paw. "So have you." Nolan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke of mutual understanding, the kind that doesn't demand words. They watched the pups play, Belle guiding one of the children gently around the yard, Dusty's bark echoing in the distance, Scout standing like a small, loyal shadow near Nolan's boots. The sky began to melt into colors, amber and rose, fading into violet at the edges. The desert had a way of turning even endings into art. Judith called from the porch, "Coffee's getting cold." "Let it," Danny said with a faint smile. "Some moments shouldn't be rushed." Nolan nodded in quiet agreement. Later that night, after the laughter faded and the pie tins were empty, Nolan stepped back into the house. The pups were curled together on the worn rug, breathing in rhythm, their fur glinting in the dim lamplight. Belle's paw rested over Dusty's back. Scout's chin lay across Belle's shoulder. By the window, Rex slept in his usual spot, his chest rising slow and steady. Outside, the desert wind hummed softly through the mesquite trees, carrying a promise of peace instead of ghosts. Nolan moved to the small wooden desk in his bedroom. The field notebook lay open where he'd left it, its pages filled over the months, notes about training, sketches, tiny victories, and the kind of thoughts he'd once been afraid to write. Between the pages were Claire's doodles, stick-figure Marines and dogs with giant smiles. He turned to the last blank page. The pen hovered for a moment before he wrote. "Mission complete. The real war was inside. And we won it, together." He set the pen down, closed the book, and rested his hand on its worn cover. Outside, the desert night stretched vast and quiet, stars scattered like silver dust across black velvet. For the first time in years, Nolan didn't feel the urge to leave. He didn't need to run from the silence anymore. Because the silence wasn't empty now. It was full, of paw prints, laughter, second chances, and the sound of life that had found its way home. Sometimes, God's miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. Sometimes they come quietly, on four paws, in a dusty crate, carried home by a weary Marine who didn't know he was the one being rescued. And maybe that rescue wasn't just for them. Maybe it was for him, too. The night had folded gently over the desert, calm and vast. The stars hung bright and close, their light flickering across the sand like scattered glass. Inside Nolan's small whitewashed house, everything was still. The pups slept in their crate, curled together in a knot of warmth. Rex lay beneath the window, breathing slow, each exhale steady as the ticking of a clock that no longer hurried time. Nolan sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, coffee cooling beside him. The desert wind carried the soft scent of sage, the hum of crickets, the faraway rustle of night creatures that only moved when the world grew quiet enough to forgive them. For once, the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. He thought of the road where it all began, that sunburnt stretch of highway where he shouldn't have stopped. He remembered the weight of that old fatigue jacket in his arms, the trembling bodies wrapped inside, and the simple note that had changed everything: "They deserve a chance." He hadn't known it then, but those words were never just about the pups. They were about him, too. A Marine hardened by war, a man carved by silence, given 3 lives that refused to give up. In saving them, he'd found a reason to stay. The door creaked open behind him. Judith stepped out, a shawl around her shoulders, her silver hair catching starlight. She handed him a plate with a leftover slice of pie. "You're up late," she said softly. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. She looked out across the yard. "They sleep easy though, don't they? That's how you know you did right." He nodded, eyes fixed on the silhouettes of the pups through the window. "Yeah. They finally trust the dark." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you do, too." For a long time, neither spoke. The night had a language all its own, the rustle of dry grass, the low hum of wind across the fence, the heartbeat of a land that had seen too much and forgiven it anyway. Judith patted his shoulder once before retreating inside. The screen door shut softly behind her. Nolan sat there until the first edge of dawn brushed pale silver over the horizon. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the open blinds, dust motes dancing like tiny spirits in the glow. The pups stretched, yawned, and tumbled into their usual morning chaos. Dusty barked for breakfast, Belle limped toward the door with her patient determination, and Scout followed close behind, his tail swaying slow and steady. Rex rose last. His movements were slower now, deliberate, each step a careful echo of strength long spent. Nolan knelt, pressing a hand to the old shepherd's fur. "Still standing, huh?" he murmured. Rex looked up, his cloudy eyes meeting Nolan's with something beyond recognition, something eternal. The kind of look that said, "You can stand on your own now." Later that day, as the sun crept higher, Danny stopped by. She helped Nolan set up a small awning over the training yard, shade for the pups, comfort for Rex. They worked in quiet rhythm, hands steady, the way soldiers always do when words aren't needed. When they finished, Danny leaned against the fence, eyes on the horizon. "You ever think about how far they've come?" she asked. Nolan followed her gaze. "Them, or me?" She smiled softly. "Both." He nodded. "Yeah. I think about it every day." The pups were chasing each other through the dirt, kicking up clouds of gold. Belle barked once at the sky. Dusty answered with his own echo, and Scout, always the observer, gave a single low woof that brought them all back to heel. Even Rex managed a tired wag. For a long while, Nolan just watched them, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He realized he wasn't just seeing 3 dogs. He was seeing chapters of his own redemption, written in paw prints across desert sand. That evening, when the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars blinked awake, Nolan opened his notebook one last time. He flipped through the pages, past the training notes, sketches, and small reflections, the scattered map of a man finding his way home. On the very last page, he wrote, "Sometimes God's miracles don't come with thunder or light. They come quietly, as paw prints on a forgotten road. 3 abandoned lives found mine, and together, we remembered how to live. Maybe the rescue was never just for them. Maybe it was for me, too." He signed it without rank, without title, just his name, Nolan Graves. Then he closed the notebook, set it gently on the table, and sat back. Through the window, he could see the yard bathed in moonlight, Belle curled near the steps, Scout guarding her flank, Dusty sprawled belly up, dreaming. Rex slept by the door, one paw stretched forward, as if reaching toward the man he'd served all his life. The night was still. Complete. Nolan leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile touching his lips. "We made it home," he whispered. And for the first time since the war, that word, home, didn't feel like a memory. It felt real. Sometimes, God's miracles don't roar from the heavens. They arrive quietly, in dusty crates and soft whimpers, in the form of second chances we didn't know we were waiting for. A Marine found 3 broken lives on a forgotten road, and through them, rediscovered his own. Because when we care for the least of his creatures, we open our hearts to a healing we never knew we needed. This story isn't just about a soldier or his dogs. It's about grace. About how love, patient, loyal, and unexpected, can be God's way of pulling us back from the edge. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that good still exists. Leave a comment. Tell us what this story means to you. And if you believe that every act of kindness ripples farther than we can see, type Amen below. May God bless you and keep you. And may you never miss the miracle that's been beside you all along.